Hi, I'm Jim Phelps, a psychiatrist with 30 years of experience treating complex mood problems and using a lot of lithium. If you're new to my videos, you can go to the trailer that'll show you everything that's on my psych education YouTube channel. You're going to discover, if you haven't discovered already, that I'm quite convinced that lithium for the prevention of dementia is a good idea. In fact, I wrote this article back in 2016 suggesting that it was time to really seriously consider this strategy back then. In this video, I'm going to present the timeline of research starting way back, but moving very quickly up to the present and including the most recent trial, the results that just came out last week. But if you're thinking about lithium for the prevention of dementia, there are the first things first. These are the recognized risk factors for the development of various dementias and really need to be addressed and should be before adding something like lithium as best as one can. And then because dementia is so devastating, I think once these have been addressed, still worth thinking about lithium. So in this video, we'll talk about two different forms of lithium, lithium orotate and lithium carbonate. Lithium carbonate is the one that's been used by prescription that I did for many, many years in psychiatry, treating bipolar disorders in particular. Lithium orotate is a compound that's been available over the counter for well over a decade and is basically just a different way to get hold of lithium. The reason you don't hear much about lithium orotate and the reason it wasn't prescribed all this time is because of a single mouse study back in 1979 by Smith and Shao, in which it was found that there was more kidney damage evident in the mice that had received lithium orotate than those that received lithium carbonate. That ended research on lithium orotate, although it's been available over the counter, again, as I mentioned, for decades. That's why we weren't prescribing it, though. Well, in 1996, we'll come back to that lithium orotate story, but we'll move on now to 1996, finding that lithium inhibits a key enzyme that's associated with developing Alzheimer's, GSK3 beta. In 2007, an article is suggesting for I think the first time that people with bipolar who were being treated with lithium as opposed to some other mood stabilizer for bipolar had a lower incidence of Alzheimer's. So lithium seemed to be protective despite bipolar itself being a risk factor for developing Alzheimer's. In 2013, this tiny study from Brazil using tiny doses, like really tiny doses, 300 micrograms of lithium, found that those who had received it seemed to have stopped their Alzheimer's progression. But the study was so small and the dose so small that I think people just didn't pay much attention to that study. A couple of years later, Lars Kessing in Denmark presented a paper in which different regions of Denmark, which have different concentrations of lithium in their drinking water, were shown to have different rates of developing Alzheimer's. The higher the lithium concentration in the drinking water, the lower the rate of developing Alzheimer's. But this study in 2019 was really, I think, the turning point, a 2-year randomized clinical trial in which lithium carbonate appeared to cut in half the incidence of new diagnoses of Alzheimer's among a population who began the study with minimal cognitive impairment. But this study was small also, British Journal of Psychiatry in 2019. And so it hasn't really had much traction. What it did for me, I really actually started taking lithium myself at that point. Then further new developments in 2023, a key new mouse study finding the opposite result of the one back in 1979 with lithium orotate. The lithium orotate mice had a lower incidence of kidney problems than those who had received lithium carbonate. So this opened the door for rethinking lithium orotate. Again, mouse data, but that was really the only reason we weren't looking at lithium orotate in the first place. And the whole logic here is that lithium orotate might deliver lithium to the brain better than lithium carbonate, so lower doses could be used. And indeed, when those proportionally lower doses were used in the mice, this opposite result was found. There's another study that I won't go into, but it's in humans. That's why it's relevant. Using a different formulation of lithium called Liprosal, or ALZ001 is the research name, under current study in phase 2 trials. I think they're headed for phase 3 soon. Just a different formulation of lithium. And it's relevant because this one will get a lot of pharmaceutical company support and marketing if it clears the phase 3 hurdles. But then this study, the 2025, just a month ago, paper in August of this year, in the journal Nature, again, another mostly mouse study, some data from humans, but an unbelievably comprehensive paper in terms of showing mechanism of lithium action, potentially interrupting the whole process of Alzheimer's development, the development of plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. So extremely important paper. I created a separate video explaining trying to offer a translation into plain English of this key study with all of the graphs from the paper. So the conclusion from that new Nature paper were these: that lithium in the brain plays a key role in the prevention of the Alzheimer's pathology, that a tiny dose, a really tiny dose of lithium per day could potentially delay dementia, and that lithium orotate is likely better for this than lithium carbonate. These days, these data primarily from mice. Well, so in that paper then, lithium orotate was found to be better than lithium carbonate. Again, now we're seeing this complete reversal of, wait a minute, maybe lithium orotate is the form of lithium we should have been using all along. That question now being opened. Now, just to show you that my enthusiasm is not shared widely, the director of scientific programs for the Alzheimer's Association, Dr. Ismail, points out and reminds us that animal models don't necessarily tell us what's going on in human brains with Alzheimer's, and the usual sober caveat: more research needed to understand the effect of lithium in brains in people, and a broader sample of people at different age ranges, for example, not just minimal cognitive impairment, as was done in that 2019 study. But then, and this is the last study I'll drag you through because it's the most recent, it's basically a replication of that key 2019 study with a slightly larger sample and more robust outcome measures. Let me just quickly show you the structure of this important and most recent finding. This is so-called LATTICE study, lithium as a treatment, and that's where the acronym comes from. So again, starting with participants who had minimal cognitive impairment. The primary outcome measure in this study was the California Verbal Learning Test, a standard measure of cognitive function, physically focusing on memory. Participants were randomized to receive lithium, starting with 150 milligrams of lithium carbonate throughout, or placebo. And then lithium was titrated more aggressively in this study up to a blood level similar to that we would use for the prevention of recurrent manic episode in bipolar. So more aggressive dosing in this study than in the 2019 study. The placebo participants received matched dummy dose increases and blood level testing to maintain the blind. And this went on for 2 years, waiting to see how this would go, taking these different pill forms all the way along, and then repeated the California Verbal Learning Test. And here's the key result. As you can see, and this is statistically significant at the p less than 0.05 level, lithium decreases in the cognitive testing where up is good were smaller than those on the placebo. the difference is not huge, and this was the only positive finding amongst all those that have been released to date. So I think there'll be more discussion of this paper, but that was the primary outcome measure that was intended, and the finding was positive. So I think in conclusion, at this point, we could say, based on the mouse data, that it is pretty clear now, I think, that lithium plays a key role in the mechanism of the development of neurofibrillary tangles with phosphorylated tau and amyloid beta plaques. I think that much the mouse data established, at least in mice, and the mechanism, including as demonstrated in the Nature paper, is so consistent with the human mechanism that I think you'd really have to stretch to remain doubtful about that in human brains. Secondly, a tiny dose of lithium per day could delay dementia. I think that hypothesis is really strengthened by these mouse data and some human data noting low levels of lithium in people with Alzheimer's compared to those with post-mortem who did not have Alzheimer's. So I think that finding is strengthened by this paper and the new data with the California Verbal Learning Test results that you just saw. And then finally, it now appears as though lithium orotate might be better for this than lithium carbonate. But we're going to have to wait for maybe another 2-year trial, which takes a year to get mounted. So we have a long time to wait yet for human data using lithium carbonate in a randomized trial for the prevention of Alzheimer's dementia. So I think the question then becomes, well, given the data so far, how long do you want to wait for more confirmatory data, or is it really time to think about starting now? I'll link here the last video in this, I think, series, at least for a while. If you think I'm in, then obviously the next question is, what dose should you consider? And I'll present some thinking on that in video linked here.